In this video, we are going to talk about subjectivism, relativism, and objectivism in ethics. I will divide this video in 4 parts. Part 1 will be about egoism, 2 about subjectivism, Part 3 will be about relativism, and Part 4 will be about objectivism. Let's start with egoism. There are 2 distinctions to be made between psychological egoism and ethical egoism. Psychological egoism simply says that humans are motivated to action by selfish reasons alone. Ethical egoism, however, says that humans not only are motivated to action by selfish reasons alone, but also that they ought to be motivated to action by selfish reasons alone. These are 2 slightly different positions. In the first case, we may be a psychological egoist, think that this is how people are motivated to action, and yet think that they can be constrained to act with respect to others. And the second one is not like that. Alright, so let me explain a little bit better. I can believe in psychological egoism, the idea that people are motivated by selfish reasons, and still want to create a society where people respect each other. I may need to create prisons or a police force to make it so that people won't do actions that would hurt others because they don't want to suffer themselves, so they don't want to suffer the consequences. In fact, philosopher Jeremy Bentham, the first utilitarian, did exactly this. Bentham was a psychological egoist. He thought that people were just motivated by selfish reasons alone. But he was also a utilitarian. He thought that the greatest happiness of the greatest number is the most important thing. Therefore, he helped create the first police force in London, and he also created a prison called the Panopticon, which was a prison where the guard could be sitting in the middle and looking at all the cells at the same time. He thought that people would behave better because they would never know when they're being watched in this prison, and you would not require violent punishment to the prisoners. Summing up, you may be a psychological egoist and believe that people are only motivated by self-interest, and yet think that we are justified in creating ways where their self-interest gets hurt when they hurt other people. So like the police force and prisons. That's what Bentham thought. So that's psychological egoism. But ethical egoism is not the same thing. Ethical egoism is saying that we should act in self-interest all the time. Not just that we do act, but that we should act in self-interest all the time. Ethical egoism is the claim that anything I do in my own self-interest is justified no matter who gets hurt. For instance, imagine that I get an immense pleasure by setting things on fire, and that I set a children's hospital on fire. An ethical egoist would say that this action was morally justified. Ethical egoism is a very difficult position to defend, obviously, as you can see from this example. But actually, some serial killers like Ted Bundy and so forth, they actually use arguments like this. They say, if I get pleasure into killing, by killing people, and you get pleasure by eating an ice cream, then why can you eat the ice cream and I can't do this? So it's not a very reasonable position, but it's definitely a position that has been defended by some people, even though you can think that they're a little bit unbalanced. Okay, so let's move on from egoism to subjectivism. It's a little bit different. Subjectivism is the view that the truth value of moral claims is different from individual to individual, that it is a matter of preference. A well-known example by philosopher Julia Driver is the sardine example. Her example, she says, well, some people like sardines and other people don't like sardines. And what's the problem? Ethical subjectivism would be claiming that Ethical positions are just like positions about liking sardines or not liking sardines. It's just a matter of personal preference, and there's nothing else to say about it. This position may seem appealing to some people because it is respecting everyone's sort of beliefs and so forth. But if ethics is purely subjective, a matter of personal preference, then someone like Heinrich Himmler would not be wrong when he said that he killed millions because he felt he should obey his leader. Furthermore, if all morality is subjective, there is no such thing as moral progress. For instance, if someone fights for civil rights, that's just their personal belief, and then someone else might have a different personal belief. So if you want subjectivism, you're kind of stuck with accepting subjectivism for everybody, including Nazis. Relativism is the view that our moral principles or moral views are always related to something else, either to an agreement, for instance, that was implicitly or explicitly entered upon, or it can also be to a culture or a group. For instance, you could think about the morals of the mafia. So for a mobster, right and wrong will depend on a certain set of rules that do not apply to someone who's not part of the mafia, for instance. Of course, typically when people talk about relativism, they're not talking about the mob. They're usually talking about cultural relativism. So cultural relativism is also a type of relativism. It says that moral truth depends on a culture. We can distinguish two aspects of this. On the one side, cultural relativism could be seen as a description. And we find that it is true that different cultures have different traditions. One way to explain this is call it the diversity thesis, that different cultures have a diversity of moral attitudes. And similarly to psychological egoism and ethical egoism, ethical relativism would be the theory that not only it is true that different cultures behave differently morally, but this is what is recommended, is how it ought to be. So there's a quote from Ruth Benedict, who was one of the first anthropologists that defended cultural relativism, and she said, "Morality is just a term for socially approved habits." Right. Another way to name this is dependency thesis. So the idea that morality depends on the culture. There's nothing beyond each culture that justifies the moral principles. Now let me try to illustrate these ideas with a couple of examples. Here's the first one. The Galatians visited the Greeks, and the Galatians told the Greeks that they ate the bodies of their dead fathers. The Greeks were horrified, and they themselves, they cremated the bodies of their parents. So that is an example, a possible example of cultural relativism. So for one culture, one thing was accepted, and for another culture, the other thing was accepted. Here's another example. Actually, both these examples are with philosopher James Rachels. So here's another example. When the Europeans first encountered the Eskimos, they noticed that they killed their babies, and that was considered morally acceptable in that culture. This may be seen by some as an example of cultural relativism. However, we can look a little deeper into the culture and see that weather conditions may have made it so that it was impossible for the families to have more than 2 babies and for the babies to survive. So therefore, their basic value that they were using was the survival of their young. In this case, what seems to be an example of relativism could actually be an example of an objective value across cultures of taking care or guaranteeing the survival of your babies. These examples, both the Eskimos and the Galatians and the Greeks, are from philosopher James Rachels. The conclusion I want to draw here is that we can accept that different cultures have different moral codes without accepting cultural relativism completely. So we can, from cultures having different moral codes, one thing that follows is that we should not consider that our culture is superior at face value. That's called ethnocentrism, and is when we think that our culture is superior. We can analyze the cultures and look for justified shared values underneath the moral behavior. We should be ready to change our own culturally accepted values if they're proven wrong as well, so our values are not superior to other values. That's a lesson from cultural relativism. Even though descriptive cultural relativism is not problematic, ethical cultural relativism has the same issues as subjectivism. So the same objections apply to relativism as they apply to subjectivism, like we saw before. One of the questions that we can ask is what counts as a culture? So that's an issue we have with cultural relativism. For instance, do the Nazis count as a culture? Does the mafia count as a culture? How do we decide what counts as a culture exactly? And the other issue is if relativism is true, then we can't look for moral progress or say that our cultures should develop in one direction or another. So every culture would be at the same moral level, so to speak, and we could not expect that there's going to be a development for the better or for the worse in any culture. So those are issues that we already had found in subjectivism, and they're also found in relativism. To end this video, let's talk about objectivism. We already talked about subjectivism and relativism. Now let's talk about objectivism. Ethical objectivism is the idea that there are some ethical principles that are universally valid. This might seem like a bold claim to make, but in fact, it is logically less demanding than subjectivism or relativism. Subjectivism and relativism claim that everything that pertains to morality is relative or subjective, while objectivism claims that there's at least one principle that could be universal. I mean, it can still leave a lot of stuff outside of that people typically identify as moral, but the only thing it has to show is that there's at least one principle that is universal. Objectivism then is less demanding than relativism because it still can include a lot of moral issues outside of the objective little circle. All right, but what could that universal principle be? You can be skeptical about that, saying, how can we possibly find a universal principle that applies to everyone across cultures? What sorts of principles can we find that would apply to all cultures? For instance, one example we already talked about is that the idea that all cultures need to help their young to survive. That all cultures need to take actions that are conducive to the survival of the next generation. So any action that is conducive to that would be justified. That proposal is by James Rachels that we already mentioned before. But there are other principles that I already talked about in other videos. For instance, the greatest happiness of the greatest number is the measure of right and wrong. That was proposed by Bentham and John Stuart Mill, and it's the utilitarian principle. That would be a proposed universal principle. And then another principle is the categorical imperative. So the categorical imperative just says that you should act only if you can will everyone to act the same way in a similar manner, then you are going to act. And that principle was proposed by Immanuel Kant. So those are some suggestions of possible universal principles that could apply across cultures and that you could use to decide if something is right or wrong. Well, that's it for this video. I talked about egoism, subjectivism, relativism, and objectivism, and I hope you enjoyed it, and thanks for watching. I hope this was helpful to you, and please subscribe and click on the bell to get notifications when new videos are added to this channel. All right, see you soon.